Years ago my sister stole my rich fiancé. At our father's funeral she smirked, "Poor you, still single at 38. I got the man, the money, the mansion." I smiled. "Have you met my husband?" I called him over. Her smile vanished, her hands trembled. She recognized him instantly, and froze. "Poor you, still single at 38. I got the man, the money, and the mansion." My sister Vanessa's voice dripped with false sympathy as she leaned closer, her diamond earrings catching the soft lighting. Around us, mourners whispered their condolences and shared memories of our father, but all I could hear was the sound of my own heart hammering against my ribs. She'd waited exactly 3 minutes after arriving to deliver the blow. 3 minutes of watching me stand alone beside Dad's casket. 3 minutes of calculating the perfect moment to strike when I was most vulnerable. Classic Vanessa, always knowing exactly when to twist the knife. "Look at you," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper but somehow managing to echo in my ears like a shout. "Standing here all alone while everyone else has moved on with their lives. It's almost pathetic." Before we continue, I want to thank you for joining me in sharing stories of resilience and transformation. If you believe that betrayal can lead to something beautiful, please consider subscribing. It's free and helps us reach more women who need hope. Now let's see how this unfolds. The funeral director's soft piano music seemed to fade into background noise as blood rushed to my cheeks. I could feel the heat of embarrassment creeping up my neck, the familiar burning sensation that had plagued me since childhood whenever Vanessa decided to remind me of my place in the world. She looked absolutely radiant in her grief, if you could call it that. Her black Chanel dress hugged her curves perfectly, her platinum blonde hair cascaded in professional waves that had probably taken hours to achieve, and her makeup was flawless despite the tears she'd been shedding for our father's business associates. Even her sorrow was designer perfect. "I mean really, Laura," she continued, adjusting the massive diamond bracelet on her wrist with deliberate slowness. "When was the last time you even went on a date? When was the last time a man looked at you and saw something worth having?" The questions hit like physical blows. When was the last time? I couldn't even remember. The years since her betrayal had blurred together in a haze of work, therapy sessions, and quiet evenings spent rebuilding myself from the ground up. I'd been so focused on healing that I'd forgotten about living. "Darren and I were just talking about it in the car," she said, glancing over at my former fiancé who stood near the guest book, his salt and pepper hair perfectly styled, his expensive suit a testament to the success he'd achieved. "How sad it is that you never recovered from losing him." The past tense hung between us like a death sentence. Never recovered. As if I were some pathetic creature who'd been pining away for 4 years, waiting for scraps of attention from a man who'd chosen my sister over me. "He feels terrible about it, you know," she continued, her voice taking on that particular tone of mock concern she'd perfected over the years. "Guilty even. But what could he do? He fell in love with someone else. These things happen. Someone else. Not just anyone, her. His fiancée's sister. The woman who'd smiled at our engagement party, who'd helped me pick out wedding invitations, who'd stood in my kitchen discussing bridesmaids' dresses while planning to steal my groom. The heart wants what it wants," she said with a delicate shrug, as if she were discussing the weather rather than the systematic destruction of my life. And obviously his heart wanted someone more sophisticated, more worldly, more woman. The final words landed like a slap. More woman. The implication was clear. I was somehow less than, lacking in the essential qualities that made a person worthy of love and commitment. I could feel the attention of nearby mourners beginning to drift our way. Aunt Margaret kept glancing over with concern, probably wondering why the two sisters were having such an intense conversation at their father's funeral. Old family friends were starting to notice the tension crackling between us like electricity before a storm. "I hope you don't think I'm being cruel," Vanessa said, her voice suddenly syrupy with false kindness. "I'm just worried about you. We all are. Standing here alone, no husband, no children, no real life to speak of. Dad used to worry about you too, you know. He'd ask me if I thought you'd ever find someone." The mention of our father's concern felt like a betrayal all over again. Had he really worried about my solitude? Had he seen me as the tragic spinster daughter who couldn't hold on to a man? "He wanted both his girls to be happy," she continued, her perfectly manicured hand resting on her flat stomach in a gesture that made me wonder if there was another announcement coming. "And I am happy, Laura. Blissfully, completely happy. I have everything a woman could want. She gestured subtly toward Darren, who was now signing the guest book with the Mont Blanc pen he'd always carried. The same pen he'd used to sign our apartment lease. The same pen he'd probably used to sign his wedding certificate with my sister. A husband who adores me, a beautiful home, financial security, a future filled with possibilities. Each word was carefully chosen, designed to highlight everything I didn't have. While you have your little apartment in Seattle and your job at that marketing firm. It's honest work, I suppose. The dismissal in her voice made my cheeks burn hotter. My little apartment was actually a charming one-bedroom with a view of the Sound, and my job was fulfilling in ways I'd never expected. But somehow, under her scrutiny, my carefully rebuilt life felt small and insignificant. I just don't understand how you can be content with so little, she said, tilting her head with genuine seeming confusion. Don't you want more? Don't you want what I have? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Did I want what she had? The cheating husband, the marriage built on betrayal, the constant need to prove her worth through material possessions? I mean, look at us, she continued, gesturing between her designer ensemble and my simple black dress. Look at where we are in life. I'm living my dreams while you're... what? Existing? Surviving. The words cut deep because they touched on my greatest fear, that I'd become so focused on healing that I'd forgotten how to truly live. That I'd let her betrayal turn me into exactly what she was describing, a woman who existed rather than thrived. But don't worry, she said, her voice taking on that patronizing tone that made my skin crawl. I'm sure someday you'll find someone. Maybe not someone like Darren, obviously, but someone appropriate. Someone who doesn't mind that you're a little damaged. Damaged. The word hit like a physical blow, echoing in my head with the force of absolute truth. Is that what I was? Damaged goods that only a certain type of man would be willing to accept? I should go comfort Darren, she said, glancing over at my former fiancé who was now shaking hands with one of Dad's business partners. He gets emotional at funerals. All that sensitivity that made me fall in love with him in the first place. She started to turn away, then paused as if struck by a sudden thought. Oh, and Laura, you might want to consider therapy. I know a wonderful counselor who specializes in women who've had trouble moving on from past relationships. She might be able to help you finally let go and find some peace. The suggestion felt like the final insult. As if my pain was something to be fixed, my lingering hurt a character flaw that needed professional intervention. But as she began to walk away, something inside me shifted. Maybe it was the therapy I'd already completed, maybe it was the 4 years of hard-won self-discovery, or maybe it was simply the knowledge that I'd survived her worst and emerged stronger. I thought about the man who'd kissed me goodbye that morning, who'd promised to be there for me through whatever this day brought. The man who'd spent the last 2 years showing me what real love looked like. Not the desperate, needy attachment I'd mistaken for love with Darren, but something deeper and more genuine. Actually, Vanessa, I said, my voice carrying a calm that surprised even me. There's something I think you should know. She turned back, eyebrows raised in polite curiosity, probably expecting another moment of vulnerability she could exploit. I'm not alone, I continued, stepping aside as I saw him approaching through the crowd of mourners. I haven't been alone for a long time. I smiled, genuinely smiled, for the first time since walking into the funeral home. Have you met my husband? The color drained from Vanessa's face so quickly I thought she might faint. Her perfectly applied foundation couldn't hide the sudden pallor, and her diamond earrings seemed to tremble as her hands began to shake. Because she recognized him instantly. They both did. And in that moment I knew the tables had finally turned. The memory crashed over me like a rogue wave as I watched the recognition dawn in Vanessa's eyes. 4 years melted away in an instant, and I was 24 again, standing in the ballroom of the Fairmont Hotel at the annual Children's Cancer Research Gala. The chandelier cast golden light across designer gowns and tuxedos. Champagne flutes clinked in celebration of the evening's fundraising success, and I had just met the man I thought would change my life forever. Darren Mitchell stood near the silent auction display, studying a weekend getaway package to Napa Valley with the focused intensity of someone accustomed to making important decisions. His charcoal gray suit was perfectly tailored, his confidence evident in the way he carried himself. Not arrogant, just assured. When our mutual friend Sarah introduced us, his handshake was firm, his smile genuine, and his eyes held mine just long enough to make my pulse quicken. Laura works at Precision Marketing, Sarah had explained. She's the creative genius behind that viral campaign for the eco-friendly startup everyone's talking about. Impressive, Darren had said, and something in his tone made me believe he actually meant it. I've been following that company's growth. Brilliant positioning strategy. We talked for 20 minutes about sustainable business practices, the challenges of startup marketing, and the delicate balance between profit and purpose. He listened, really listened, asking thoughtful questions that showed he valued my opinions. When he asked for my business card, I felt like I was floating. Our first date was dinner at a small Italian restaurant in Pioneer Square. He arrived with a single white tulip, my favorite flower, which he'd somehow remembered from our brief conversation about spring gardens. The gesture felt both thoughtful and perfectly understated. We talked until the restaurant staff began stacking chairs around us, lost in discussions about travel dreams, family traditions, and the books that had shaped our worldviews. By our third date, I was already imagining introducing him to my family. He had this way of making me feel heard, valued, like my thoughts and dreams mattered to someone who understood ambition and success. When he kissed me goodnight outside my apartment building, his lips soft and tentative, I felt like the heroine of every romance novel I'd secretly devoured. Dad loved him immediately. They bonded over golf, business strategy, and their shared appreciation for single malt whiskey. I'd find them on the back porch during family dinners, deep in conversation about market trends and investment opportunities. Dad would light up whenever Darren's name came up in conversation, constantly praising his intelligence, his work ethic, his obvious devotion to me. "That boy's going places," Dad would say, beaming with pride as if Darren were already his son-in-law. "And he clearly adores you, sweetheart. The way he looks at you, like you hung the moon." Even Mom, who'd passed away 2 years earlier, would have approved. I could feel her presence sometimes during those early months with Darren, could almost hear her whispering that she'd finally found someone worthy of her oldest daughter. Vanessa's initial reaction had been carefully calibrated enthusiasm. She gushed about how perfect we looked together, how lucky I was to have found such a catch, how excited she was to potentially have Darren as a brother-in-law. But even then, something felt slightly off about her effusiveness. Her compliments came too quickly, her smiles seemed practiced, and her hugs lasted just a beat too long, as if she were studying him rather than simply welcoming him to the family. "He's absolutely gorgeous," she'd whispered to me after our first family barbecue, her fingers lingering on my arm. "Those eyes, that smile. You better hold on to him tight, sis. Men like that don't stay single long." The comment had made me laugh at the time, but looking back it felt more like a warning than encouragement. The engagement came 8 months later during a weekend trip to Vancouver. Darren had planned everything perfectly: sunset dinner at a waterfront restaurant, a private table overlooking the harbor, the ring hidden in a dessert that arrived with, "Will you marry me?" written in chocolate script across the plate. I said yes before he'd even finished his nervous speech about wanting to spend forever making me happy. The ring was beautiful, a classic solitaire setting with a diamond that caught light like captured starfire. Not the biggest stone I'd ever seen, but elegant and timeless. "I wanted something that would suit you," Darren had explained. "Classic, sophisticated, enduring." Wedding planning consumed the next 6 months of my life. I threw myself into every detail with the same intensity one brought to my marketing campaigns. Venue scouting, dress fittings, menu tastings, flower arrangements. Vanessa offered to help and I gratefully accepted. She had an eye for style and unlimited time since she'd recently left her job at the art gallery. "Let me handle the vendor meetings," she'd insisted. "You're so busy with work and I love this stuff. We want everything to be perfect for your special day." Her dedication seemed touching at first. She attended cake tastings when I couldn't leave the office, met with photographers to review portfolios, even helped coordinate with Darren's groomsmen about tuxedo fittings. I felt lucky to have such a supportive sister, someone who cared enough about my happiness to invest so much time and energy in making my wedding dreams come true. But gradually, small cracks began to appear in my perfect life. Darren started working later, missing dinners we'd planned, arriving at my apartment with apologies and explanations about difficult clients and project deadlines. His phone buzzed constantly during our time together, texts and calls that he'd answer with quick, whispered conversations in the hallway or bathroom. "Sorry, babe," he'd say, returning with a distracted kiss on my forehead. Crisis at the office. You know how it is. I did know how it was. I worked in a demanding field too. But something about his explanations felt rehearsed, like lines he'd practiced in advance. Then there was the perfume. Subtle at first, just a hint of something floral and expensive clinging to his shirts when I picked up his dry cleaning. Not my scent. I'd always preferred clean, simple fragrances like vanilla or lavender. This was more sophisticated, more complex. Gardenias and jasmine with undertones of something darker, more sensual. Must be from a client meeting, he'd explained when I mentioned it. You know how some women go overboard with perfume in professional settings. The explanation made sense, but the scent appeared more frequently. On his jacket after late meetings, on his car seats, even once on his pillow when I stayed over at his apartment. Each time he had a reasonable explanation. A female colleague who rode in his car, a client dinner at a restaurant where the hostess had been over-perfumed, a hotel room that hadn't been properly aired out between guests. Meanwhile, Vanessa was becoming increasingly involved in our relationship. She'd drop by Darren's office with coffee and pastries, claiming she was in the neighborhood, after meeting with wedding vendors. She'd text him directly about ceremony details instead of going through me, explaining that she didn't want to bother me during busy workdays. "Your sister is amazing," Darren would say after these encounters. "So thoughtful, so organized. You're lucky to have someone who cares so much about making your day perfect." I should have been grateful. Instead, I felt oddly displaced, like I was watching my own wedding being planned from the outside. Vanessa knew details about our flowers that I hadn't approved, had opinions about our menu choices that somehow carried more weight than mine, and spoke about our vision, as if she were the bride instead of the helpful sister. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening in March. I'd left work early with a splitting headache and decided to surprise Darren with dinner from his favorite Thai restaurant. His assistant had mentioned he was working late on a proposal, so I figured he could use the sustenance and company. The building directory in his office lobby listed his company on the 14th floor. I took the elevator up, balancing takeout containers in my purse, mentally rehearsing the surprised smile I'd give when he looked up from his computer. The hallway was dimly lit, most offices already empty for the evening. His door was slightly ajar, warm light spilling into the corridor. I could hear voices inside, his familiar baritone and another voice that made my blood run cold with recognition. "We can't keep doing this," Darren was saying, his voice heavy with an emotion I'd never heard from him before. "She's going to find out." "Not if we're careful," came the reply in Vanessa's unmistakable whisper. "The wedding's only 2 months away. After that we can figure out how to." I pushed the door open without thinking, my hands moving of their own accord. The takeout containers hit the floor with a crash of spilled curry and broken styrofoam, but I barely noticed the mess spreading across the expensive carpet. They were wrapped around each other on his leather couch, her dress half unbuttoned, his shirt completely gone. 4 months of wedding planning, 8 months of what I'd thought was love, and 2 years of believing I'd finally found my happily ever after. All of it crumbled to ash in the space between one heartbeat and the next. They sprang apart like guilty teenagers, Vanessa's face flushed with shame and something else. Triumph, maybe, or relief at finally being caught. "Laura," Darren started, reaching for his shirt with shaking hands. "This isn't, we didn't mean for." But I was already backing toward the door, my engagement ring sliding off my finger before conscious thought could stop the motion. It hit his desk with a tiny crystalline sound that somehow seemed louder than my breaking heart. I ran. The sound of my car door slamming echoed through the empty parking garage beneath my new apartment building in Seattle's Capitol Hill neighborhood. Everything I owned in the world sat crammed into my Honda Civic. 3 suitcases, a box of books, my laptop, and a pathetic collection of kitchen essentials I'd grabbed during my 15-minute escape from the life I'd built with Darren. I'd driven straight through from home, stopping only for gas and terrible coffee, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles had gone white somewhere around Spokane. The GPS had guided me to this address that I'd found on Craigslist during a desperate 3 a.m. apartment hunt. A studio apartment I'd rented sight unseen because the landlord was willing to waive the credit check for an extra month's deposit. The building smelled like old carpet and industrial disinfectant. My apartment was on the 4th floor, accessible only by a narrow staircase that groaned under the weight of my belongings. As I unlocked the door marked 4C, I held my breath, unsure what level of disaster awaited me. The space was smaller than I'd imagined, maybe 400 square feet if I was being generous. A Murphy bed dominated one wall, a kitchenette barely large enough for one person occupied another, and two windows overlooked a brick wall and a narrow alley where cats fought over garbage scraps. The hardwood floors were scarred with decades of previous tenants' lives, and the bathroom had clearly been added as an afterthought, cramped and poorly ventilated. It was perfect. Anonymous, affordable, and completely removed from everything that reminded me of the person I used to be. I spent my first week in Seattle eating cereal for every meal and crying at random intervals, in the grocery store checkout line, while folding my few pieces of clothing, during commercial breaks of mindless television shows. The tears came without warning, triggered by everything and nothing. A couple holding hands on the street. A jewelry store advertisement. The simple act of making coffee for one instead of two. My bank account dwindled with terrifying speed. I'd quit my job in a moment of emotional upheaval, burning bridges with a resignation email that was far more honest than professional. Savings that had once seemed substantial now looked pitiful when stretched to cover rent, utilities, groceries, and the basic necessities of starting over from absolute zero. The job search felt like a special kind of torture. Every interview required me to explain the gap in my employment, to craft careful lies about seeking new challenges, instead of admitting I'd fled my hometown after discovering my fiancé and sister together. Rejection emails arrived with clockwork regularity, each one a small confirmation that I was as fundamentally broken as I felt. Finally, after 3 weeks of increasingly desperate applications, I received a call from a small digital marketing agency called Bloom Creative. They needed an administrative assistant. Someone to answer phones, schedule meetings, organize files, and handle the unglamorous tasks that kept the business running. The pay was barely above minimum wage, the benefits non-existent, and the office was located in a converted warehouse that smelled perpetually of coffee and industrial printer ink. I took the job immediately. My first day at Bloom Creative, I arrived 20 minutes early and sat in my car in the parking lot, giving myself a pep talk that felt more like a threat. You can do this, Laura. You can answer phones. You can file paperwork. You can act like a normal human being for 8 hours. The office was a chaos of creative energy that both intimidated and fascinated me. Graphic designers hunched over massive monitors, their workstations covered in color swatches and typography samples. Account managers gestured frantically during client calls, switching between charm and panic with impressive speed. The air hummed with deadlines, caffeine addiction, and the particular tension that comes from running a small business on passion and prayer. My desk was tucked into a corner near the reception area, equipped with an ancient computer, a phone that rang constantly, and a filing system that appeared to have been organized by someone having a nervous breakdown. My supervisor, Janet, was a harried woman in her 50s who spoke in rapid-fire sentences and consumed coffee like it was a life-sustaining medication. Just answer the phone politely, schedule meetings without creating conflicts, and try not to lose any important paperwork, she'd said on my first morning. Oh, and don't take anything the creative team says personally. They're artists. They communicate through sarcasm and existential crisis. The work was mind-numbing but mercifully distracting. I answered calls from clients who wanted to know why their logos weren't more purple, scheduled meetings between people who seemed to actively despise each other, and filed invoices with the methodical precision of someone grateful to have concrete tasks that couldn't break her heart. During my lunch breaks, I'd walk to Pike Place Market and sit on a bench overlooking Elliott Bay, watching ferries shuttle back and forth between Seattle and the islands. The water changed color throughout the day, steel gray in the morning, deep blue in the afternoon, almost black by evening. I'd eat sandwiches from a corner deli and try to imagine what kind of person I might become in this new place. After 2 months of barely surviving, Janet pulled me aside after work one Friday. "You seem competent," she said, which I'd learned was high praise coming from her. "And you're the first admin we've had who doesn't cry when the designers get cranky. How would you feel about taking on some client coordination responsibilities? It comes with a raise." The additional duties involved managing project timelines, serving as a buffer between creative teams and demanding clients, and occasionally writing emails that required actual thinking rather than just scheduling. For the first time since fleeing home, I felt like my brain was being used for something more complex than basic survival. One particularly stressful Thursday, After a client had screamed at me over the phone about font choices for 20 minutes, I found myself crying in the bathroom stall during my lunch break. Not the gentle tears of grief I'd grown accustomed to, but ugly, frustrated sobs that came from feeling completely overwhelmed by the simplest adult responsibilities. "Rough day?" asked a voice from the neighboring stall. I looked down to see sensible black flats and gray slacks. Ruth from accounting. A woman in her early 40s with prematurely silver hair and an endless supply of cardigans who'd been unfailingly kind since my first day. "Just client stuff," I managed, trying to make my voice sound normal. "Want to grab a drink after work? I know a place with terrible wine and excellent therapy potential." Something about her matter-of-fact offer broke through my carefully maintained isolation. "I don't really drink much anymore," I admitted. "Neither do I. But sometimes sitting in a bar and pretending you might order alcohol is exactly the kind of normal you need." We ended up at a dive bar called the Comet, nursing ginger Alish and sharing a basket of greasy fries while Ruth told me about her divorce 3 years earlier and her ongoing battle with her teenage daughter's rebellion phase. "You know what saved my sanity?" she asked, stealing a fry from my side of the basket. "Therapy. Good therapy, not the kind where someone just nods and asks how that makes you feel. I found this woman, Dr. Patricia Chin, who basically rebuilt my brain from the ground up." She slid a business card across the sticky table. "She's expensive, but she's worth every penny. And she has a sliding scale for people who are rebuilding their lives." Dr. Chen's office was nothing like I'd expected. Instead of the sterile, clinical environment I'd imagined, her space felt warm and lived in. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with psychology texts mixed with novels and poetry collections. Her desk was covered with succulents in mismatched pots, and a large window overlooked a small garden where wind chimes created a gentle soundtrack to our sessions. "Tell me about the person you were before," she said during our first meeting, her voice carrying a slight accent that made every word sound carefully considered. I'd expected to talk about Darren, about the betrayal, about the wedding that never happened. Instead, we spent weeks exploring who I'd been before I'd ever met him. The ambitious marketing professional who'd landed her dream job straight out of college. The daughter who'd organized surprise parties for her parents' anniversaries. The friend who'd driven 6 hours to help someone move apartments. "Trauma has a way of making us forget our own strength," Dr. Chin explained during one particularly difficult session. "You survived something that would have broken many people. That's not weakness. That's remarkable resilience." Slowly, painfully, I began to remember that I was more than just someone who'd been betrayed. I was someone who'd built a successful career from nothing, who'd maintained friendships through college and beyond, who'd once been confident enough to give presentations to rooms full of executives without breaking a sweat. The healing wasn't linear. Some days I felt strong and hopeful, ready to rebuild my life with purpose and intention. Other days, I'd find myself crying over a romantic comedy trailer or avoiding the grocery store because I couldn't bear to see couples shopping together. But gradually, the good days began to outnumber the bad ones. Ruth's friendship became my anchor to normalcy. She invited me to her book club, a group of women who met monthly to discuss novels and drink wine in each other's living rooms. At first, I sat quietly in corners, contributing little to conversations about complex characters and plot twists. But as months passed, I found myself engaging more, offering opinions, even laughing at inside jokes. "You're different," Ruth observed one evening as we walked back to our cars after a particularly lively discussion about a mystery novel set in post-war London. "When you first started coming to these meetings, you looked like you were ready to bolt at any second. Now you look like you actually want to be here." He was right. For the first time in months, I'd spent an entire evening without thinking about Darren or Vanessa or the life I'd lost. I'd been present, engaged, genuinely interested in other people's thoughts and experiences. That night, I called Dr. Chin and left a voicemail. "I think I'm ready to start dating again. Not because I'm lonely, but because I think I might actually have something to offer someone." Her return call came the next morning. "That," she said, "is exactly the right reason. Dating after betrayal felt like learning to walk again after a devastating accident. Every step tentative, every movement measured for potential pain. My first attempt was a disaster of epic proportions. Ruth had set me up with her neighbor's brother, a perfectly nice accountant named Kevin who spent our entire coffee date explaining his coin collection and asking if I'd ever considered the investment potential of vintage baseball cards. I excused myself after 45 minutes, claiming a work emergency, and spent the drive home wondering if I was destined to attract men who were either unfaithful or unbearably boring. Maybe those were my only options now: cheaters or collectors of outdated sports memorabilia. The second date was worse. A software engineer from a dating app who arrived 20 minutes late, ordered the most expensive item on the menu, and spent the evening mansplaining my own marketing career to me. When he suggested we split the bill after eating 2 appetizers, an entree and 3 craft cocktails while I nursed a single glass of wine and a salad, I decided the universe was sending me a clear message about my romantic future. Maybe I'm just meant to be single, I told Dr. Chin during our session the following week. Maybe some people are designed for solitude. Or maybe, she replied with that knowing smile I'd grown to both love and fear, you're just not meeting the right people in the right circumstances. Sometimes the best connections happen when we're not actively searching for them. She was right, though I wouldn't realize it for another 3 months. Marcus walked into my life on a Tuesday morning in October, carrying a box of promotional materials for a client presentation and wearing a navy blue sweater that brought out the gray in his eyes. He wasn't particularly tall, maybe 5'10", but he moved with a quiet confidence that commanded attention without demanding it. His dark hair was touched with silver at the temples, and when he smiled at Janet while introducing himself, the expression seemed genuine rather than practiced. "This is Laura," Janet said, gesturing toward my desk. "She'll be your point person for the Morrison Hotels project." He turned to me with that same smile, extending his hand in a firm handshake that lasted exactly the appropriate amount of time, long enough to be warm, short enough to remain professional. "Marcus Hamilton," he said. "I'm looking forward to working with you." His voice was deeper than I'd expected, with a slight rasp that suggested either a long-time smoking habit or naturally low vocal cords. When our eyes met, I felt a small flutter of something that might have been attraction, but I pushed it down immediately. Work was work, and I'd learned to keep those boundaries crystal clear. Marcus owned a boutique consulting firm that specialized in hospitality industry marketing, restaurants, hotels, tourism boards. His approach was methodical and thorough, unlike many of our clients who changed their minds every few days and expected us to read their thoughts about color schemes and font preferences. Our first meeting lasted 2 hours. While most clients spent project kickoffs talking about themselves and their revolutionary vision for disrupting their industry, Marcus asked questions about our process, our timeline, our previous experience with similar brands. He took notes in a leather-bound notebook, writing with an expensive pen that he handled like a precision instrument. "What do you think makes a hospitality brand memorable?" he asked me directly while Janet was distracted by a phone call. The question caught me off guard. Most clients treated me like a glorified secretary whose opinion on actual strategy was neither wanted nor valued. "Consistency," I said after a moment's thought. "Not just in visual identity but in experience. The best hotel brands make you feel the same way whether you're in New York or Nashville. They understand that luxury isn't about thread count, it's about feeling understood." He nodded slowly, making another note. "That's exactly right. Most people think hospitality marketing is about amenities and location. But it's really about emotional connection." Over the following weeks, Marcus became my favorite client to work with. He responded to emails promptly, provided feedback that was specific and actionable, and never once raised his voice or questioned my competence when project details needed adjustment. When our designer quit unexpectedly in the middle of his campaign, leaving us scrambling to meet deadlines, Marcus simply asked what he could do to help rather than threatening to take his business elsewhere. "I could reach out to some freelancers I've worked with before," he offered during an emergency meeting. "No obligation to use them, but it might give you some options while you're interviewing replacements." The freelancer he recommended ended up being exactly what we needed: talented, reliable, and available immediately. When I thanked Marcus for the referral, he shrugged as if helping solve our staffing crisis was the most natural thing in the world. "Good people should support each other," he said simply. Our professional relationship began shifting into something more personal during the final weeks of his project. He started arriving a few minutes early for meetings, lingering afterward to chat about everything except work. I learned he'd grown up in Portland, studied business at Northwestern, and moved to Seattle 5 years earlier to be closer to his aging mother. He asked about my background with genuine curiosity, listening to my carefully edited stories about leaving my hometown for new opportunities without pressing for details I wasn't ready to share. "You seem like someone who's lived through interesting times," he said one afternoon as we walked to his car after a particularly productive strategy session. "Interesting is one way to put it," I replied, surprised by how much I wanted to tell him the whole truth. "The best people usually have complicated stories," he said, unlocking his car, a practical Honda that was impeccably clean inside and out. "Simple backgrounds tend to produce boring personalities." When his project officially concluded, I felt an unexpected pang of disappointment. Our meetings had become the highlight of my work week, small islands of intelligent conversation and genuine respect in an ocean of difficult clients and impossible deadlines. "I hope we'll work together again soon," I said as we shook hands in the lobby after our final presentation. "Actually," Marcus said, his voice carrying a note of uncertainty I'd never heard from him before, "I was wondering if you'd like to have dinner sometime. Not work-related. Just dinner." The invitation hung between us like a bridge I wasn't sure I was brave enough to cross. He must have seen the hesitation in my eyes because he quickly added, "No pressure. I just thought it might be nice to continue our conversations without project deadlines hanging over us." "I'd like that," I heard myself saying before my anxious brain could construct a list of reasons to decline. Our first non-work dinner was at a small French bistro in Fremont. Marcus had chosen the restaurant carefully, intimate enough for real conversation but public enough to feel safe. He arrived with a single white tulip just like Darren had on our first date, but somehow the gesture felt completely different. Where Darren's flower had felt calculated, designed to impress, Marcus's tulip seemed thoughtful and understated. "I remembered you mentioned these were your favorites," he said, looking almost embarrassed by his own romanticism. We talked for 3 hours, the conversation flowing naturally from travel dreams to family memories to books we'd loved and movies that had disappointed us. Marcus was funny in an unexpected way, his humor dry and observational rather than attention-seeking. He made me laugh until my cheeks hurt, something I hadn't done in longer than I cared to calculate. When he walked me to my car, I found myself hoping he'd ask me out again before I'd even driven away. He did 3 days later with a text message that was perfectly Marcus, direct but warm. "Would you like to try that new Thai place downtown Saturday night? I promise not to order anything too spicy if you promise to tell me more about your book club's latest dramatic selection." Our second date led to a third, then a fourth. Slowly, carefully, we began building something that felt both exciting and safe. Marcus never pushed for information about my past, never pressured me to move faster than I was comfortable with, never made assumptions about what I wanted or needed. He simply showed up, consistently and reliably, offering companionship without conditions. 3 months into dating, during a quiet dinner at his apartment, Marcus poured himself a second glass of wine and said, "There's something I should probably tell you about my work history." My stomach clenched automatically. Experience had taught me that sentences beginning with, "There's something I should tell you," rarely ended well. "I used to compete directly with someone you might know," he continued, his eyes meeting mine across the candlelit table. "Darren Mitchell. Small world, right?" The wine glass slipped from my fingers, hitting the table with a sharp clink that seemed to echo in the sudden silence. Marcus reached across immediately, steadying both the glass and my trembling hand. "I nearly dropped my wine," I said stupidly, my brain struggling to process what he'd just revealed. "I figured you might have a reaction," he said gently. "Want to talk about it?" The silence that followed my introduction stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Marcus stepped closer, his presence solid and reassuring beside me, while Vanessa's face cycled through a spectrum of emotions I'd never seen from her before. Shock, recognition, confusion, and finally, something that looked suspiciously like panic. "Marcus Hamilton," he said, extending his hand to Vanessa with the same professional courtesy he'd shown countless clients. "I don't believe we've been formally introduced, though I certainly know who you are." Vanessa's perfectly manicured hand trembled as she accepted his handshake, her usual predatory confidence nowhere to be found. The woman who'd built a career out of manipulating social situations suddenly looked like she'd forgotten how to speak. "Hello," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. The transformation was remarkable. In less than 30 seconds she'd gone from triumphant tormentor to confused prey. Darren had gone completely rigid beside her, his face pale beneath his expensive tan. He looked like a man who'd just realized he was standing in quicksand with no rope in sight. "Hamilton," Darren said, his voice carefully controlled but carrying an undercurrent of something that might have been fear. "I didn't expect to see you here." "Family connections," Marcus replied with a slight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Laura's father was a remarkable man. Though I suppose you knew that, having been engaged to his daughter once upon a time." The words landed like stones in still water, creating ripples that spread outward to the other mourners within earshot. I could see heads turning, whispered conversations pausing as people tried to piece together the sudden tension crackling between the four of us. Mrs. Henderson, who'd been standing near the flower arrangements, took a small step closer, her hearing aid probably picking up more than she was pretending. Behind her, I could see Dad's business partner, Robert Chin, watching our little group with the sharp attention of someone who recognized the early stages of a significant drama. "Engaged." Vanessa's voice cracked slightly on the word, as if she were just now processing the full implications of Marcus's presence. "Laura, you never mentioned." "There's a lot I never mentioned," I said quietly, surprised by how calm I felt. The anxiety that had been clawing at my chest since entering the funeral home had transformed into something else. Not quite satisfaction but a deep sense of rightness, as if the universe had finally decided to balance the scales. Marcus's hand found mine, his fingers intertwining with mine in a gesture that was both protective and possessive. The simple touch communicated volumes: solidarity, support, and an unshakable certainty that whatever came next we'd face it together. "You two are married?" Darren asked, his voice carrying a note of disbelief that bordered on insulting. As if the idea that I could have found someone successful and accomplished, was beyond his comprehension. 2 years this October, Marcus replied, his thumb tracing a gentle circle across my wedding ring. "Laura's brought more joy to my life than I thought possible." The declaration was simple but devastating in its sincerity. Where Darren had always spoken about our relationship in terms of what I could do for him: boost his social standing, support his ambitions, provide companionship when convenient, Marcus spoke about what I'd given him simply by existing. I watched Vanessa's face as the full scope of the situation began to dawn on her. This wasn't just any random man I'd married to spite her. This was Marcus Hamilton, someone whose name clearly meant something to both her and Darren, whose presence here represented far more than a simple romantic rebound. "But how did you?" She started, then stopped, apparently realizing that any question she asked would only dig her deeper into whatever hole she was discovering beneath her feet. "How did we meet?" I supplied helpfully. "Marcus was a client at my marketing firm in Seattle. We worked together on a campaign for Morrison Hotels. Such a successful project. It really established his company as a major player in hospitality consulting." Each word was carefully chosen, designed to highlight not just Marcus's professional success but also my own competence and independence. The woman standing here wasn't the broken, abandoned creature Vanessa had expected to find. I'd built a career, a life, a marriage, all without her permission or oversight. Robert Chin had moved closer now, no longer pretending not to eavesdrop. His eyes held a glimmer of recognition that made Darren shift uncomfortably. "Hamilton," Robert said, stepping into our circle with the confidence of someone who'd just connected important dots. "Weren't you the one who landed the Pacific Northwest Tourism Board contract? Quite the coup from what I heard. Especially considering the competition." Marcus nodded modestly. "We were fortunate to present the strongest proposal." "Strongest proposal," Darren repeated, his voice tight with barely controlled frustration. "Is that what you're calling it?" "I'm calling it good business," Marcus replied, his tone remaining perfectly level. "Though I understand your perspective might be different." The exchange was subtle enough that casual observers might miss its significance, but I could see the understanding dawning on several faces around us. Whatever had happened between Marcus and Darren in their professional lives, it hadn't ended well for Darren. "You underbid us by 30%, Darren said, abandoning any pretense of funeral propriety. "That's not strategy, that's desperation." "I provided better value," Marcus corrected gently. "There's a difference." The client certainly seemed to think so, considering they've retained our services for 3 additional projects since then. Vanessa's eyes darted between the two men like she was watching a tennis match, her usual social sophistication completely abandoned. She looked lost, confused, like someone who'd walked into a movie halfway through and couldn't follow the plot. "I don't understand," she said finally, her voice small and uncertain. "How long have you two known each other?" "Professionally? About 6 years," Marcus said. "Though we've only worked in direct competition twice. Both times were illuminating." Mrs. Henderson had given up all pretense of not listening and was now openly staring at our group. Behind her, I could see other mourners beginning to cluster closer, drawn by the unmistakable energy of family drama unfolding in real time. "Laura never mentioned any of this," Vanessa said, her voice gaining a slight edge as she tried to regain some semblance of control over the situation. "Laura and I don't discuss my business rivalries at home," Marcus replied smoothly. "We prefer to focus on more pleasant topics. Though I suspect she might have found this particular connection amusing, given the circumstances." The understatement hung in the air like incense. Amusing barely began to cover how I felt about discovering that my new husband had not only known my ex-fiancé but had apparently bested him in business on multiple occasions. Darren's jaw worked silently, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. The composure he'd maintained throughout the funeral was cracking, revealing something ugly and desperate underneath his polished exterior. "You planned this," he said suddenly, his voice loud enough to carry to the growing circle of observers. "This whole thing, meeting Laura, marrying her, it's all some elaborate revenge scheme." The accusation was so absurd, so completely divorced from reality that I actually laughed. The sound emerged before I could stop it, bright and genuine in the heavy atmosphere of grief and tension. "Revenge," I repeated, my voice carrying clearly in the sudden quiet that had fallen over our corner of the funeral home. "You think I married Marcus to get back at you?" The idea was so ridiculous that even some of the eavesdropping mourners looked skeptical. Darren's paranoia was showing, his inflated sense of his own importance on full display for everyone to see. "That would require me to still care about you enough to plan revenge," I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word. "It would require me to think about you at all." The truth of that statement hit me as I spoke it. For the first time in 4 years, I realized that Darren had become irrelevant to my life. Not someone I hated or resented, but simply someone who no longer mattered. Marcus squeezed my hand gently, a small gesture of approval and support that grounded me in the present moment. Around us, the whispered conversations had resumed with new intensity. I could see the story spreading through the crowd like ripples in a pond. The sister who'd stolen the fiancé, the abandoned bride who'd found something better, the business rivals meeting at a family funeral. By tomorrow, half the town would know that Laura Mitchell had married the man who'd outmaneuvered Darren in business, and the other half would be calling their friends to catch up on the gossip. Vanessa seemed to understand this better than anyone. Her face had gone ashen as she watched our extended family and Dad's associates piece together the implications of what they were witnessing. For someone who'd built her identity around being envied and admired, the sudden shift in public perception was clearly devastating. The knock came 3 days after we'd returned to Seattle, soft and hesitant against our apartment door. Marcus was in his study, reviewing client proposals while I sorted through the condolence cards that had arrived in our absence. The funeral felt like a distant dream now, surreal in the way traumatic events often do once you're removed from their immediate aftermath. I opened the door expecting a neighbor or delivery person, but instead found Vanessa standing in our hallway. The transformation was so complete that for a moment I didn't recognize her. Gone were the designer clothes, the perfect makeup, the armor of expensive accessories that had defined her for as long as I could remember. She wore jeans, actual jeans, not the designer variety that cost more than most people's rent, and a simple gray sweater that looked like it had seen multiple wash cycles. Her face was bare of makeup, revealing dark circles under her eyes and a pallor that spoke of sleepless nights. Her platinum blonde hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and her hands, those perfectly manicured hands that had once displayed her massive wedding ring like a trophy, were naked except for a simple gold band that looked somehow diminished without its usual accompanying diamonds. "Laura," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Can we talk?" I stood in the doorway for a long moment, studying this stranger who wore my sister's face. Part of me wanted to close the door, to protect the peace Marcus and I had built from the chaos she represented. But another part, the part that remembered sharing secrets under blanket forts and practicing dance routines in our childhood bedroom, felt compelled to let her in. Marcus is working, I said finally, stepping aside to allow her entry. We can sit in the kitchen. She followed me through our small apartment, her eyes taking in the modest furnishings, the photographs of our wedding day, the comfortable clutter of two people who'd built a life together through careful accumulation rather than dramatic acquisition. If she was judging our simple lifestyle compared to the mansion she'd described at the funeral, her face didn't show it. We sat across from each other at my kitchen table, the same table where Marcus and I ate breakfast every morning, where we discussed our days over dinner, where we'd planned our future during countless quiet conversations. Having Vanessa in this sacred space felt like inviting a storm into a sanctuary. I don't know where to start, she said, her hands wrapped around the coffee mug I'd offered her as if it were a lifeline. Everything's falling apart, Laura. Everything. The words came out in a rush, as if she'd been holding them in for so long that they'd built up pressure behind her carefully constructed facade. She told me about the money, how Darren had been living beyond their means for years, using credit and loans to maintain the lifestyle he felt entitled to. The mansion was mortgaged to the hilt, the cars were leased with payments they could barely afford, and her jewelry, the diamonds she'd flaunted so proudly, were mostly financed through a high-end jeweler who was now threatening legal action. He controls everything, she said, her voice breaking slightly. Every credit card, every bank account, every investment. I don't even know how much debt we're really in because he handles all the finances. But the calls have started, collection agencies, lawyers, creditors. They call all day, every day. I listened without interrupting, watching my sister, this woman who'd once seemed invincible in her cruelty, crumble before my eyes. The irony wasn't lost on me that she'd spent the funeral bragging about having the man, the money, and the mansion, when all three were apparently built on financial quicksand. The worst part, she continued, her voice dropping to barely audible, is that I think he resents me for it. For the debt, for the pressure, for not being worth all the trouble he went through to get me. The phrase hung between us like a confession. To get me, as if she were a prize he'd won rather than a person he'd chosen to love. As if their entire relationship had been transactional from the beginning, and now that the transaction was proving costly, he was having buyer's remorse. The funeral was the first time he'd looked at me with anything other than irritation in months, she admitted. And even then it was only because other people were watching. The moment we got in the car afterward, he started yelling about Marcus, about how I'd humiliated him, about how my family had always been beneath his standards. She looked up at me then, her eyes red-rimmed and desperate. Why didn't you ever fight me back, Laura? Why didn't you try to destroy me the way I destroyed you? The question caught me off guard, not because I hadn't expected it, but because I'd never really examined my own motivations closely enough to articulate an answer. Why hadn't I fought back? Why hadn't I tried to expose their affair before the wedding, or sought revenge in the immediate aftermath? Because I didn't have to, I said finally, the words coming from some deep well of understanding I hadn't known existed. Time fought for me. It was true, I realized as I said it. While I'd been rebuilding myself in Seattle, learning to be whole again, time had been working its own quiet justice. The relationship built on betrayal had rotted from within, just as Dad used to say about buildings constructed on weak foundations. You could paint over the cracks and reinforce the walls, but eventually the fundamental flaws would bring the whole structure down. Vanessa stared at me across the table, her expression a mixture of confusion and something that might have been admiration. You really moved on, she said. You actually built something real. Yes, I said simply. I did. She was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee mug in absent circles. When she spoke again, her voice was so soft I had to lean forward to hear her. I found something while I was cleaning out Dad's desk, she said, reaching into her purse and withdrawing a small leather-bound journal. I thought you should see it. The journal was one I recognized from childhood, Dad's daily planner, where he'd written everything from business appointments to grocery lists to random thoughts that struck him throughout the day. Vanessa opened it to a page marked with a faded receipt and slid it across the table. The entry was dated 6 months before Dad's death, written in his familiar scrawl. Asterisk, talked to Laura today. She sounds happy, really happy, not just putting on a brave face. Her voice has music in it again, the way it used to when she was little and would sing while doing chores. I think she's found her way back to herself. My girls were once best friends, drawing pictures together, sharing everything, protecting each other from the world. Vanessa has forgotten that version of herself, but maybe someday she'll remember. Maybe someday they'll both find their way back to each other. Sis. The words blurred as tears I hadn't expected filled my eyes. Dad had seen through all of it. My careful cheerfulness during our phone calls, Vanessa's hollow victory, the fundamental sadness that had colored our family dynamic since the betrayal. But he'd also seen hope, possibility, the chance for healing that I'd never even considered. He never stopped believing we could fix this, Vanessa whispered, her own tears falling freely now. Even after everything I did, everything I destroyed, he still thought. She couldn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. Dad had seen something in both of us that we'd lost sight of. The capacity for redemption, for growth, for becoming better than our worst moments. We sat in silence for several minutes, the journal open between us like a bridge across 4 years of pain and resentment. I found myself remembering the sister Vanessa had been before jealousy and competition had poisoned our relationship. The girl who'd taught me to braid friendship bracelets, who'd stayed up all night with me when I had pneumonia, who'd fiercely defended me against playground bullies with the righteous fury of an avenging angel. I don't expect forgiveness, Vanessa said finally, closing the journal and sliding it back toward me. I don't deserve it, and I'm not even sure I know how to earn it. I just wanted you to know that I understand now. What I took from you wasn't just a man or a wedding. I took your faith in family, in loyalty, in love itself. She stood up slowly, like someone much older than her 36 years. But you found your way back anyway. You found something real with Marcus, something I don't think I've ever had. That takes courage I never possessed. I walked her to the door, my heart heavy with emotions I couldn't name. This wasn't the dramatic confrontation I'd imagined for years, the moment where I'd finally unleash all my accumulated hurt and rage. Instead, it felt like watching someone I'd once loved very much finally understand the true cost of their choices. Vanessa, I called as she reached for the door handle. She turned back, hope flickering briefly in her exhausted eyes. You didn't ruin my life, I said, surprised by the calm certainty in my own voice. You shattered it completely. But you also gave me the chance to build something better from the pieces. Something that was actually mine. She nodded, a small smile ghosting across her lips. The first genuine expression I'd seen from her since childhood. Take care of yourself, I added. Really take care of yourself. After she left, I sat alone with Dad's journal, reading his words over and over until Marcus found me there an hour later. I told him about the visit, about the debt, about the quiet devastation of a life built on lies finally collapsing under its own weight. Do you feel vindicated? He asked, pulling me into his arms. I considered the question seriously. Did I feel vindicated? Satisfied? Triumphant? No, I said finally. I feel sad. But also, free. And for the first time in 4 years, that was enough. If this story of quiet triumph had you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button right now. My favorite part was when Laura introduced Marcus and watched Vanessa's face turn to stone, realizing who he was. What was your favorite moment? Drop it in the comments below. Don't miss more empowering stories like this. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload.